I was holding his airway when his eyes flew open wide, wet, furious. The monitors kept their calm beeps, but the OR didn't. He couldn't move, couldn't plead, yet his throat ripped out one name, Elena. The meds swallowed him again. And my mind snapped back to the morning we wheeled him in. By 6:12 antes do meio-dia. The hospital already smelled like yesterday's battle's antiseptic that never quite wins. Burnt coffee that pretends it's warmth. And that faint metallic chill that lives in the air conditioning no matter the season. My badge tapped against my chest as I walked, a small, steady percussion under the distant chorus of rolling wheels and clipped voices. On my phone, a case manager's message blinked twice, then again, asking for one more note to satisfy an insurer that always needed proof that suffering was real. I slid the phone back into my pocket and let my fingers rest on the pen in my scrubbed top, like it could sign away the weight. Marcus Holley arrived with the kind of politeness people wear when they're terrified and trying not to infect anyone else with it. Late 50s, hands roughened by work, nails that carried a permanent shadow of grease no soap ever fully erased, even now. His wife, Dana, kept a folder hugged to her ribs as if paperwork could stop a heart from misbehaving. And their daughter hovered just behind, eyes sharp, jaw clenched in that teenage way of trying not to cry in front of strangers. Marcus smiled at me when I introduced myself, and the smile trembled at the edges like a candle in a draft. He said he'd promised he'd be home in time to help zip a graduation gown in 2 weeks, and Dana nodded to fast, as if agreement could become a guarantee. In the pre-op bay, the curtain didn't block the world so much as thin it, turning the hospital into muffled shapes and half-heard grief. I checked his wristband, listened to his lungs, watched the way his fingers kept flexing and releasing against the sheet, like he was testing whether he still had a say in anything. They told me it's routine, he said, and the word routine sounded like a prayer he'd borrowed from someone else. When I explained that routine didn't mean small, only planned, his eyes flicked to Dana's folder. She opened it without being asked, a practiced motion, and inside were authorization letters, denial letters. Appeal forms, an entire paper trail that proved they'd had to fight just to earn the right to be scared in the proper room. Doctor. Kent Ralston swept in with his surgical calm, the kind that can feel like mercy or like distance, depending on which side of the bed he's standing on. He talked about risks the way pilots talk about weather, serious, controlled, never lingering long enough for panic to catch his coat. Marcos nada den hesitast Ralston's shoal my chest. To the names stitched on my scrubs, as if names mattered more than titles right now. Last time I was here, Marcus said softly, there was a nurse. Elena. She talked to me when I couldn't sleep. She said. He stopped. Dana's knuckles whitened around the folder. Ralston's eyes didn't change. Not visibly, but something in the room tightened, the way air does before a storm decides where to land. Or 7 was already set when we rolled him down, its bright lights bleaching everything into the same honest color. The room hummed with readiness. The ventilator SE soft exhaled the rhythmic chirp of monitors, the squeak of rubber solace on polished floor. On the wall near the scrub sink, the whiteboard still carried the ghost of old writing under the fresh marker strokes, a palimpsest of cases and names erased too quickly. A few months ago, Elena Park's name had been on that board more often than not, written in neat, confident letters. Then there was an incident, an unexplained collapse, a frantic code. A silence afterward that spread faster than any memo. People stopped saying her name out loud, as if sound itself could summon questions no one wanted to answer. As we positioned Marcus, I caught the circulating nurse newer, eager double-checking packs, and indicators with the intensity of someone who'd heard the whispers and decided fear was best handled with diligence. The scrub tech, older, quieter, didn't look at the corner where Elena used to tuck a spare pen behind her ear and grin like we were all in on a joke. I noticed a sterilization log sheet on the counter with a blank where an initial should have been. A tiny omission that felt too small to matter until it didn't, somewhere beyond the doors. The hospital's invisible metronome kept ticking. Turnovers, quotas, scheduling, the constant push to do more with less and call it efficiency. When I leaned close to Marcus to place the mask and guide him towards sleep, his eyes stayed on mine longer than most patients do, as if he were trying to memorize a face he might need later. "If you see Elena," he whispered, voice thin, embarrassed by its own vulnerability, "tell her I'm sorry. I never thanked her. I didn't answer not because I didn't want to, but because in that moment, I didn't know how to tell him that apologies can arrive too late and still be heavy enough to change the room." I only squeezed his shoulder through the warm blanket, felt the tremor there, and watched as the medication softened his gaze, pulling him away from us with a gentleness that always feels like theft. By the time Marcus reached recovery, the surgery had that exhausted, fragile success that makes everyone breathe again but never fully relax. The heart was beating, yes, but it beat like a person after a long-run hard one, not casual. I was already scrubbing out when the first call came. A tight voice from PACU saying his blood pressure was slipping, then a pause that said the number, out loud without saying it. Hospitals have their own language, and in it, slipping is a cliff with a polite name. I jogged down the corridor, the floor shining under fluorescent lights that never blink, past families holding paper cups like anchors, past a janitor humming softly as if song could keep the dread from settling. In Marcus's room, the air felt warmer than it should have, thick with that faint, sour edge of sweat and fear that no amount of sanitized wipes can erase. The monitors weren't calm anymore. Their beeps had sharpened, urgent, a metronome suddenly set to fast. A nurse I hadn't met yet, Gabriel Reed, his badge said, stood at the bedside. Hands steady, eyes not leaving Marcus's face. Marcus's skin looked slightly gray at the temples, his lips dry, his eyelashes fluttering like he was trying to return to the surface of a dark lake. Dana stood near the door, clutching the folder again, but now the folder looked ridiculous. Paper against physiology, bureaucracy against blood. Gabriel spoke with the low, even tone of someone who learned early that panic is contagious. He told Dana, gently, that Marcus's body was reacting. That sometimes after big surgery the body misreads the situation and overreacts like a fire, alarm set to sensitive. Dana nodded while her gaze bounced from Gabriel's mouth to Marcus's chest, as if she could catch the truth in the rise and fall there. Their daughter, Riley, kept a phone in her hand without looking at it, thumb hovering. The way teenagers hold a lifeline when they don't know who to call. I watched Marcus's fingers twitch faintly, not purposeful, more like a dream trying to speak through muscle. The first fever came like a bad omen that arrives wearing a lab number. It wasn't dramatic at first, just a slight climb. A nurse's brow furrowing, a whisper that's odd. Then came the shiver that rippled through Marcus's shoulders. The dampness at his hairline, the sudden flush in his cheeks, as if his body had lit a small internal fire. Someone mentioned infection in that careful, cautious tone we use, when words can become lawsuits. I saw Gabriel's eyes flick toward the chart, then toward me, and in that flicker was an entire conversation. Not yet, but maybe soon. Not impossible, but not normal. Only how Lee heard stuff, talking in fragments, nothing official, nothing bold. Just the human habit of trying to stitch meaning into chaos. OR7 came up twice, spoken quickly, like a superstitious person saying a ghost story name and then knocking on wood. Someone else said Elena Parks' name and immediately looked around as if cameras could hear. It made my stomach tighten in that slow way, not a sharp fear, but a sinking recognition. In a place where everything is documented, the most dangerous things are often the ones people only say under their breath. When Ralston arrived, he didn't stride. He glided, like a man who trained his body to transmit confidence. He examined Marcus, asked for numbers, listened, and then paused just long enough to reveal that even he felt the shift in gravity. "We're not going to ignore this," he said, and it was meant to soothe. But I watched Dana's face and saw she heard the unspoken part. We also can't name what we're thinking yet. Outside the room, Gabriel exhaled through his nose. A quiet release, and I realized he'd been holding his breath the way I had in the OR, waiting for the moment the story decides whether it's tragedy or survival. By afternoon, the hospital's polished surfaces felt like they were reflecting something darker than light. I sat in a small conference room that smelled of stale donuts and printer toner, my hands wrapped around a cup of coffee gone cold again, as if temperature was one more thing the day had stolen. Across from me, Dr. Malcolm Shortchief of surgery. All iron sleeves and controlled breath kept his gaze on a tablet filled with charts and timestamps. Next to him sat a woman from Risk, hair pulled tight, posture tighter, speaking the way people speak when they're trying to make the future less expensive. The door was closed, but the tension leaked anyway, seeping into the hall like disinfectant. Marcus's labs were pointing in a direction none of us wanted to name too loudly. Not because naming it would create it, but because naming it would force a chain of actions that could not be undone. If this was an infection tied to the operating suite, it was no longer just Marcus's crisis. It was an institutional wound. A wound you could either clean painful, honest, necessary, or cover with a neat dressing and hope it didn't rot underneath. Shaw asked me in that careful leader tone to walk through the morning in OR7, who touched what looked off, what felt wrong. He didn't ask about feelings, but my mind served them anyway. The blank initial on the log, the speed everyone moved with, the unspoken pressure to keep the room turning. Risk didn't say cover up. She said narrative. She said unconfirmed. She sighed, we can't alarm the family with speculation. She spoke about probabilities. The way insurers speak about coverage, as if the numbers absolve the people holding them. I thought about Dana, her folder, her willingness to believe rules could protect her. I imagined telling her that a shortcut might have been taken in the name of efficiency, that a complaint might have been filed and then buried under meetings and reminders and performance metrics. I imagined Riley watching us the way she already was, memorizing each pause in our speech like a detective in a room of suspects. Shaw finally said Elena Park's name in full, no flinch, and the room went quiet the way an OR goes quiet when someone drops a tool. She raised concerns. He admitted, eyes still on his tablet, voice measured. Sterilization compliance. Turnover times. The usual pressures. The words usual pressures made something in me flare. Because what we call usual is often just what we've learned to tolerate. Elena had died months ago, and the official story had been an accident. A freak event, a terrible day that no one could have predicted. But stories get used the way bandages do, to stop bleeding, not to heal. The ethical question wasn't abstract. If we initiated a formal contamination investigation, protocols would trigger. Notifications, audits, cancellations, blame. Surgeons would lose cases. Administrators would lose revenue. Staff would lose sleep and maybe jobs. If we didn't, and Marcus worsened, we'd be choosing comfort over truth. And layered on top of that, like a second colder ceiling, was the insurance reality, approvals needed for prolonged ICU stays. For certain medications, for advanced support if his body demanded it. I'd seen families learn, in real time, that being critically ill doesn't pause the billing clock, it accelerates it. I heard myself speak before I had fully decided to. If Elena was right, I said. Then ignoring this is how you make her right twice. Shaw's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping once near his cheek. Risk looked at me like I'd sworn. But Shaw didn't dismiss it. Instead, he asked for the sterilization records, the staff assignments, the maintenance logs, for the sweet every piece of paper that could either reveal a truth or help someone hide it. The decision wasn't made with a gavel. It was made with a reluctant nod, the kind that costs you later. When we stood to leave, I felt the weight of my stethoscope again, heavier than it had been that morning, as if it now carried Elena's silence alongside Marcus's heartbeat. Marcus crashed just after midnight. When the hospital grows deceptively quiet and every sound feels louder because fewer people are making it. The call came as a sharp alarm, then feet, then a voice over the intercom that tried to stay calm and failed. By the time I reached his room, the hallway lights seemed harsher, turning everyone's face into angles. Gabriel was already there, hands moving with purpose, his voice a steady thread through the chaos. Dana stood pressed against the wall, eyes wide, lips parted as if her body had forgotten how to form words. Riley had her arms around herself, shoulders trembling, gaze locked on her father like she could hold him in place by staring. Inside the room, Marcus looked smaller than he had that morning, as if the fight had begun shaving pieces off him. The monitor's rhythm was wrong, stumbling, and the blood pressure numbers were falling like a clock counting down. The air smelled of sweat and plastic and that faint scent of antiseptic that always feels to clean for what's happening. Someone handed me gloves, and I pulled them on too fast, the latex snapping at my wrist like a reprimand. Ralston arrived, hair slightly damp, expression tight, and in his eyes I saw the moment he accepted what he didn't want. We were going back in. They wheeled Marcus toward the operating suite with urgency that made the hallway blur. The gurney rattled over threshold seams, a harsh vibration that traveled up my arms as I walked beside him. In the elevator, the hum of fluorescent lights felt like a buzzing inside my skull. I kept my hand near his shoulder, not because it helped clinically, but because touch is one of the last human things left when everything else becomes machines. As we reached the OR doors, a coordinator met us with a tablet, breathless, trying to speak over the alarms. The insurer needed confirmation before certain high-cost interventions, as if Marcus's body would wait politely for an authorization code. Ralston's voice went low and dangerous. "We don't negotiate with physiology," he said, and pushed through. OR7 was the closest available. The number hit me like a cold splash. For a second, I saw Elena's ghost in my mind, not a haunting figure, just a memory of her standing at the sink, singing under her breath, making the sterile world feel less merciless. The team moved fast, the room filling with the clatter of trays and the brisk rustle of gowns. I did what I always do, anchored the airway, watched the monitors, fed the body the right kind of sleep while it tried to fall into the wrong kind. The beeps became my language again, and in that language the message was clear. We were losing him. As Ralston opened, the blood seeped in a way that didn't feel like normal surgical bleeding. It felt angry, systemic, as if Marcus's body had decided every boundary was optional now. The suction's wet roar filled the room, loud enough to drown thought. And still I heard it, someone in the corner, a scrub tech whispering, "This is the same suite." No one answered. Subtext lives in silence, and our silence was screaming. Ralston's shoulders were rigid, hands precise, but even precision can shake when the stakes are personal. He asked for a medication, then another, and the numbers briefly obeyed before slipping again, like a leash in rain. Then, in a small moment that could have been missed, the circulating nurse held up a sealed pack and frowned. The indicator strip meant to confirm sterility looked wrong, faint where it should have been bold. A tiny detail, the kind that shouldn't decide life or death, and yet in that room it felt like a confession. Ralston stared at it for a beat too long, and I saw the dilemma turn into action in his eyes. "Get a new pack," he snapped, voice sharper than I'd ever heard from him. "Open nothing until it's verified." It cost time we didn't have. It also bought honesty we couldn't afford to lose. Marcus's heart rhythm faltered again, a terrifying flutter on the screen that made the room hold its breath as one organism. I pushed what I could push, adjusted what I could adjust, feeling the sweat collect at the base of my neck under the surgical cap. Gabriel wasn't in the room now. ICU had handed him off, but I imagined his steady hands, his quiet competence, and I borrowed that steadiness the way you borrow a prayer. Ralston made a decision that would later be scrutinized by people who weren't here. He ordered advanced support without waiting for the insurer's approval. The room didn't cheer. We just worked because in the climax of a life, there's no soundtrack, only beeps, breath, and the thin line you refuse to let break. Morning arrived quietly, the way it always does after a night that tried to swallow someone whole. The ICU windows didn't show sunlight so much as a pale promise of it, filtered through city haze and glass that never opens. Marcus lay surrounded by machines that seemed both protective and accusatory, their steady sounds now less frantic, muddy, watchful. Gabriel stood at the bedside again, posture slightly slumped from hours of vigilance. The elastic marks of his mask faintly pressed into his cheeks. He had that look nurses get after a long crisis, eyes still sharp, body already paying the price. Dana slept in a chair, with her head bent at an impossible angle, the folder finally on the floor beside her like a shed skin. Riley sat awake, knees drawn up, her phone dark in her lap, because there are moments no one wants to document. When Marcus's blood pressure held steady for a full hour, Dana woke as if tugged by an invisible string. She looked at Gabriel first, not the monitors, because she'd learned overnight what mattered most: the face of the person watching your loved one breathe. Gabriel spoke softly, choosing words the way you choose bandages: careful, clean, meant to protect. "He's still very sick," he said, "but he's here. He's still fighting." Ralston came by after rounds, hair combed, expression tired in a way he couldn't iron out. He didn't stand at the foot of the bed like a commander. He stood close enough to be human. He told Dana that they'd controlled the bleeding, that Marcus had needed more support than expected, that the next days would be uncertain. He didn't say the word infection out loud in that first breath, but Dana heard it anyway. Her eyes narrowed, and her voice finally found its edge. "Was something wrong in that room?" she asked. In the operating room, the air changed. Even the beeps seemed to hesitate. In the hallway afterward, I watched Shaw and Risk speak in low tones. Their bodies angled away from families, like turning away could keep truth contained. A formal review had started quietly, urgently, with sterile processing, supply tracking, personnel interviews. The hospital had a way of treating investigations like storms: board the windows, keep patients calm, protect the building's image, but storms still flood basements. I thought about Elena Park again, and for the first time in months, I let myself picture her not as a tragedy, but as a person laughing at a bad joke, rolling her eyes at an administrator's memo, insisting on doing it right even when right was inconvenient. Later, when Riley stepped out for air, she stopped beside me at the nurse's station. Her voice was small but steady, the way young people sound when they're forced into adulthood early. "My dad kept saying, Elena," she said. He said it even before the surgery, like he was trying to remember someone's face. I told her what I could without breaking the rules that always seem. Designed to protect institutions over individuals, that Elena had been a nurse here, that she had died, that she had cared deeply about patient safety. Riley's eyes filled, not with fear this time, but with anger. "Then why didn't anyone tell him?" she whispered. I didn't have an answer that would make the world feel fair. That afternoon, Marcus briefly opened his eyes fully this time. No trapped panic, just exhaustion. His gaze drifted, found Dana, found Riley, and his lips moved around a word that barely made sound. "Dana terso de blanket." When she looked up at me, her eyes asked the question people always ask after near loss: what now? And who pays? I knew the insurer would ask its own questions, cold and procedural, and I hated that both sets of questions existed in the same room. But I also saw something else. Marcus was still alive to ask forgiveness, to say thank you, to finish what Elena had started by refusing to let good enough become a standard. I left the hospital after my shift the way I always do, through sliding doors that exhale cold air, into a world that feels insultingly normal. Cars moved, people laughed into phones. A man walked his dog like no one had fought for breath all night, just a few floors away. The parking garage smelled like rain and exhaust, and my hands still carried the phantom tightness of gloves, as if my skin remembered the snap. I sat in my car, without starting it, listening to the silence that comes after too many alarms, and felt the strange loneliness of surviving a crisis you can't explain to anyone who wasn't there. On my phone, there were messages already waiting, an administrator asking for a timeline. Risk requesting a brief statement, billing flagging the unapproved intervention like it was a moral failing. The language was polite, sterile, almost elegant in its ability to avoid the word life. For a moment, I imagined Elena reading those messages, her mouth twisting the way it used to when she saw something that didn't sit right. She would have made a joke dark, sharp, and then she would have gotten serious. Elena had that gift. She could make you laugh and then, in the same breath, make you do better. The hospital's investigation would produce binders and meetings and corrective plans with bullet points. It might even produce consequences, though I'd learned not to bet on that. But what it couldn't produce was the look on Dana's face when she realized that routine is often a story we tell people so they don't run. It couldn't quantify Riley's quiet rage, the way she watched every nurse's hands now. Every sealed pack, every wiped surface, like she'd become a guardian by necessity. And it couldn't capture the moment Marcus woke her that day, still weak, still tethered, and asked, in a voice like sandpaper, did I thank her? Did anyone thank Elena? When I went back in the next evening, I stopped by the small plaque in the staff corridor that most people walked past too fast. Elena Park's name sat there among others, the hospital's attempt at remembrance without discomfort. I stood in front of it long enough for the hallway to empty, long enough to hear the distant rhythm of gurneys and the muffled laugh of a resident who hadn't learned. Yet what laughter costs, I didn't pray, not exactly. I just let myself feel the truth that hospitals teach in fragments. You can do everything right and still lose. And you can do something wrong and call it systemic until it doesn't feel like anyone's fault. Marcus would recover slowly if he recovered fully at all. The infection, if that's what it was, would leave a mark on his body the way fear leaves a mark on a family. Invisible to strangers, undeniable to those who live with it. The unapproved intervention would be debated in committees by people who never heard the wet roar of suction, never felt time collapse into seconds, never watched a teenager clutch her own arms as if she could keep her father from disappearing. And yet, if the investigation forced a single process to change, if a single shortcut died where it should have died months ago, then Elena's voice would have reached beyond her own ending. That's the scar this case left on me, not the memory of a scream in OR7, but the realization that the dead sometimes speak through the living in ways that don't require ghosts. They speak through paperwork finally taken seriously, through hands washed one extra time, through a surgeon who refuses to wait for permission to save a life, through a nurse who tells a family the truth even when it's messy. In the end, Marcus's scream wasn't just a mystery, it was a demand, a name thrown into a room full of masks, forcing us to look at what we'd tried not to see, and reminding us that the cost of silence is always paid by someone who never agreed to the bill.